In a remote corner of the galaxy, far from the bustling trade routes and the glittering lights of the more populated star systems, there existed a planet that few outsiders had ever seen. This world was unlike any other, a place of harsh landscapes, jagged mountains, and deadly storms that could wipe out an unprepared explorer in minutes. The inhabitants of this planet were known across the stars as the Deathworlders, a species feared, misunderstood, and often dismissed as monsters by those who had never lived through the trials of their home. But the truth was far more complex. The Deathworlders were not naturally cruel or aggressive. They had been shaped by centuries of survival in an environment that demanded resilience, intelligence, and a willingness to do whatever was necessary to live. Life on the Deathworlders planet was not easy. Water was scarce, food was limited, and the very air itself could be toxic in certain regions. Every creature, every plant, and every terrain feature posed a challenge, teaching the Deathworlders the art of adaptation. From a young age, they learned to read the signs of nature, which plants were edible, which storms were deadly, and which predators could be out. They became masters of strategy, planning several steps ahead just to survive the next day. In doing so, they cultivated not only physical strength but mental sharpness, a quality that would later make them formidable opponents across the galaxy. Despite the harshness of their planet, the Deathworlders were deeply connected to their environment. They understood the delicate balance of their ecosystem and knew how to harness its dangers to their advantage. When they built their homes, they were not merely shelters, they were fortresses disguised as natural formations, blending seamlessly into the jagged terrain so that intruders could not find them until it was too late. They constructed complex networks of tunnels, hidden observation posts, and traps that could neutralize threats without the need for open confrontation to the outside universe. Their world seemed uninhabitable, but for them, it was a place of mastery and survival. Over the centuries, as the Deathworlders' reputation grew, other civilizations began to take notice. Most of these outsiders, who lived on calmer, safer planets, found the Deathworlders' ways alien and frightening. They called them aggressive, violent, and unpredictable. In reality, the Deathworlders had simply learned lessons that most civilizations had never faced. The lesson that weakness could be fatal, that betrayal was everywhere, and that only those who were vigilant and prepared could endure. This misunderstanding between the Deathworlders and the rest of the galaxy planted the seeds for centuries of tension. Throughout history, the Deathworlders had been exploited, attacked, and manipulated by other species who sought to benefit from their skills, resources, or land. There were countless stories of traders who had tried to cheat them, of armies that had underestimated their defenses, and of politicians who had lied to them during peace talks. Each act of deception left a scar, and with every scar came a new lesson. Trust must be earned, and the consequences of betrayal would be severe. The Deathworlders were patient, but their patience should never be mistaken for weaknesses. In the years leading up to the events that would shake the galaxy, the Deathworlders had largely kept to themselves. While other civilizations expanded, fought wars, and built empires, the Deathworlders observed silently from their distant world. They watched the galaxy's powers grow arrogant, seeing alliances form and break, wars start and end, and countless species make the same mistakes over and over again. The Deathworlders analyzed it all, learning from the successes and failures of others. They mapped the politics, technology, and strategies of every major civilization. They knew their enemies' strengths, weaknesses, and blind spots. Every move the galaxy made was catalogued, studied, and memorized. But the Deathworlders did not act rashly. They understood that revenge or retaliation required precision, planning, and perfect timing. They were not a species driven by impulsive anger. They were strategists, patient and calculating. The stories that circulated about their cruelty often came from those who had only glimpsed the surface of their power. Few realized that behind every display of force was a careful plan designed to ensure survival, justice, or balance. To the Deathworlders, fairness meant something different than it did to others. It was a principle grounded in survival, honesty, and respect. Those who broke trust would eventually pay, and the galaxy was about to learn that lesson in the most dramatic way possible. During this period of silent observation, the Deathworlders began to quietly prepare. They gathered intelligence not just from spies or scouts, but from every possible source across the galaxy. They studied star maps, trade routes, military installations, and political systems. They developed advanced technology, not for reckless conquest, but for strategic advantage. Their fleet, though smaller in number compared to the larger galactic powers, was unmatched in resilience, speed, and tactical flexibility. Every ship, weapon, and device was designed to exploit the mistakes of others. They were creating tools of precision, the kind that would allow them to strike decisively when the moment came. At the same time, the Deathworlders focused on training their people. Every member of their society, from the youngest to the oldest, learned the importance of strategy, teamwork, and adaptability. Combat simulations were run daily, teaching lessons in navigation, attack, and defense. Intelligence operatives were trained to move unseen, to gather information without detection, and to anticipate the moves of potential adversaries. No skill was wasted, no lesson ignored. They were preparing not for random battles, but for a campaign that could decide the fate of the entire galaxy. Meanwhile, other civilizations went about their lives, confident in their superiority. They saw the Deathworlders' planet as distant and unimportant, believing it could never challenge them. Some even mocked the species, calling them backward, savage, or primitive. But the Deathworlders had long learned to hide their true capabilities. They allowed arrogance to grow in the hearts of their enemies, knowing that overconfidence would become a weapon in itself. The galaxy's powers were building their own downfall without realizing it. Despite their careful planning, the Deathworlders never lost sight of their identity. They remained deeply tied to their planet, culture, and history. Stories of past betrayals, of narrow escapes, of victories won against impossible odds, were shared across generations. These stories were not just tales. They were lessons, shaping the values, strategies, and mindset of every Death. They taught patience, cunning, and the importance of observing before acting. They've reinforced a sense of unity, reminding the people that survival depended on collective strength as much as individual skill. By the time the galaxy finally made a move that would trigger the Deathworlders' revenge, the species was ready. Every resource, every plan, every soldier, and every piece of technology had been prepared for the inevitable moment when patience would turn to action. They had observed, they had trained, and they had waited, knowing that when the time came, their retaliation would not be chaotic or emotional. It would be precise, calculated, and devastating. The calm that had existed for so long on their harsh homeworld was only the surface. Beneath it lay a force capable of shaking the galaxy to its core. In essence, the Deathworlders' world was a crucible. It had forged a people unlike any other, a civilization that combined resilience, intelligence, and relentless strategy. Their silence in the years leading up to the war was not weakness. It was preparation. Their patience was not passivity. It was mastery. And their eventual rise, fueled by years of observation and careful planning, would ensure that when they finally acted, no species, empire, or alliance would ever underestimate them again. This period, the calm before the storm, set the stage for the incredible series of events that would soon unfold. The galaxy, busy in its own politics and conflicts, had no idea that a force it had dismissed as distant and unimportant was quietly preparing a response that would not just challenge them but change the course of history. The Deathworlders were ready, and when the first spark of their revenge was lit, the galaxy would never be the same. The moment that would ignite the Deathworlders' revenge began quietly, almost invisibly, in the political halls and council chambers of the galaxy. For decades, the galaxy's civilizations had viewed the Deathworlders with a mix of fear, misunderstanding, and arrogance. They assumed that distance and the harshness of the Deathworlders' homeworld made them weak, incapable of projecting power beyond their own planet. Leaders of powerful alliances believed they could manipulate the Deathworlders, force them into submission, or extract concessions with clever negotiations and promises. They thought that the Deathworlders were isolated, a species that could be ignored until convenient, underestimated, or exploited. But these assumptions were dangerous, naive, and entirely wrong. It all began with what was supposed to be a peaceful diplomatic negotiation. Several influential species and political coalitions had grown tired of the Deathworlders' independent actions and unpredictable reputation. They believed it was time to teach them a lesson and assert dominance. Invitations were sent, elaborate preparations were made, and plans to corner the Deathworlders into submission were quietly set in motion. To the outside world, this event appeared to be a diplomatic breakthrough, a chance to finally bring a feared species under control through words and formal agreements rather than open war. But it was, in reality, a trap. The Deathworlders, as always, were not deceived. They had spent decades watching, listening, and studying the galaxy. They had carefully tracked political shifts, alliances, and military movements. They knew which civilizations were growing impatient, which were arrogant, and which relied too heavily on appearances. When the invitations for the peace negotiations arrived, the Deathworlders accepted, fully aware that something was wrong. They did not attend blindly, nor did they trust the words of those who had deceived them in the past. Instead, they sent a team of observers, analysts, and elite strategists to assess every detail of the negotiations. Every word, every gesture, every subtle sign of deception was recorded and analyzed. What happened next was a perfect example of how the galaxy had underestimated the coalition that had prepared the trap believed that they were striking a decisive advantage. They had positioned their fleets, fortified their stations, and even prepared hidden sabotage that would weaken the Deathworlders' defenses. Their plan relied on the assumption that the Deathworlders would not anticipate deception, that they would come to the table as equals and not recognize the signs of danger. They assumed the Deathworlders were simple, predictable, and easily manipulated. But the Deathworlders were not only aware of the plot, they had anticipated it. Once the trap became apparent, the Deathworlders' response was immediate and calculated. Unlike many species, they did not panic, flee, or make a rash decision. They had trained for such scenarios for decades. Their commanders had prepared contingency plans for every conceivable betrayal, and they had systems in place that allowed them to act swiftly without waiting for orders or confirmation. Within hours of recognizing the threat, the Deathworlders' fleets were mobilized, moving with precision across multiple star systems. Their ships, though smaller in number than the Coalition's forces, were faster, more resilient, and equipped with technology designed specifically to exploit weaknesses. They struck before the Coalition even realized that their trap had failed. The speed and precision of the Deathworlders' response stunned the galaxy. Entire military installations that were thought to be secure were neutralized in unexpected ways. Communication lines were cut, surveillance networks disabled, and strategic points destroyed before reinforcements could arrive. To the unprepared observers, it appeared as though the Deathworlders had eyes and ears everywhere, as if they had anticipated every move. In reality, it was a combination of careful planning, intelligence gathering, and a deep understanding of their opponent's tendencies. Every attack was deliberate, calculated, and designed to achieve maximum impact with minimal loss to themselves. One of the most striking aspects of this response was the way the Deathworlders used deception against their deceivers. They allowed some targets to appear secure, luring the Coalition into overconfidence. They created false signals and traps, making their enemies believe they were gaining the upper hand, only to strike unexpectedly and decisively. This use of strategy and misdirection was not born of cruelty, it was born of necessity. The galaxy had spent centuries trying to manipulate the Death, and now the Deathworlders were simply returning the favor in a manner that ensured survival and justice. The impact of these initial strikes went far beyond the battlefield. News of the Deathworlders' retaliation spread quickly, causing panic and confusion across multiple star systems. Civilizations that had never interacted with the Deathworlders before suddenly realized the magnitude of the threat. Political leaders who had assumed control over their regions found themselves powerless in the face of a force they had underestimated. Panic led to mistakes, mistakes led to chaos, and chaos allowed the Deathworlders to continue their campaign with terrifying efficiency. What made this phase of their revenge particularly remarkable was the discipline of the Deathworlders. Despite the intensity of the situation, they did not allow emotion to cloud their judgment. Unlike many species that might have sought revenge in a chaotic, uncontrolled manner, the Deathworlders maintained focus on their objectives. Their strikes were targeted, their movements coordinated, and their actions guided by strategy rather than anger. Each step was part of a larger plan, designed to achieve specific goals, neutralize threats, send a message, and restore balance in a galaxy that had long exploited them at the same time. The Deathworlders continued to demonstrate a surprising level of intelligence and diplomacy. While they were prepared to destroy those who acted against them, they also recognized opportunities to avoid unnecessary destruction. Civilizations that showed willingness to cooperate, surrender, or acknowledge their mistakes were given options, though always under conditions that ensured the Deathworlders' security and respect. This approach further demonstrated that their revenge was not about random destruction or cruelty. It was about justice, about enforcing consequences for betrayal, and about establishing a clear order in which the Deathworlders' rights and dignity could not be ignored. During this period, the galaxy began to see the Deathworlders in a new light. Stories of their cunning, strategic brilliance, and relentless efficiency spread like wildfire. Leaders began to reconsider their assumptions, realizing that the species they had dismissed as savage and distant was, in fact, one of the most formidable forces in the galaxy. Panic and fear replaced arrogance, and every action taken by the Deathworlders was scrutinized for lessons in strategy, patience, and calculation. The very civilizations that had plotted their trap now faced a harsh reality, that underestimating the Deathworlders had been a grave mistake. Meanwhile, back on their homeworld, the Deathworlders maintained their connection to their roots, even in the midst of galactic-scale operations. They remembered the lessons of their harsh planet, the need for careful observation, the importance of preparation, and the value of resilience. Young Deathworlders were trained continuously, not only in combat but in strategy, planning, and analysis. Every individual understood the stakes and the reasons behind their actions. This unity and shared purpose allowed them to act as one cohesive force, a feature that gave them an unmatched advantage over divided, overconfident enemies. The galaxy had begun to feel the consequences of its misjudgment. The Deathworlders' careful observation, intelligence gathering, and calculated response had turned what could have been a disaster for them into a demonstration of overwhelming power. Entire sectors were destabilized, alliances strained, and leaders forced to reconsider their strategies. The so-called peace negotiations had backfired spectacularly, sparking a conflict that would escalate far beyond the expectations of those who had planned it. It was no longer just about survival or defense, it was the beginning of a broader campaign that would ultimately reshape the galaxy. The spark had been ignited, and the Deathworlders, with their patience, strategy, and discipline, were ready to turn that spark into a controlled, unstoppable blaze of revenge. The galaxy, once confident in its superiority and control, now faced a force that had been underestimated for centuries, a species that had waited, planned, and learned how to turn betrayal into opportunity. In this moment, The Deathworlders had proven one fundamental truth: arrogance and deception would never overpower a species that understood the value of patience, intelligence, and precision. The galaxy had lit the fire, but it was the Deathworlders who controlled it, determining where it would spread, who it would consume, and how it would reshape the balance of power for generations to come. The stage was now set for a series of events that would engulf stars, devastate civilizations, and establish the Deathworlders as a force that could not be ignored or underestimated. Once the Deathworlders decided to act, their retaliation was swift, precise, and unstoppable. The galaxy, which had long underestimated them, suddenly found itself facing a force unlike any it had ever seen. The first attacks were surgical in nature, targeted strikes that demonstrated not only the Deathworlders' power but also their intelligence. They did not rush blindly into battle. Every move was calculated, every strike designed to maximize impact and minimize waste. Civilizations that had relied on complacency and overconfidence were suddenly faced with devastation they could not have anticipated. The Death Fleet was small compared to the vast armadas of the galaxy, but size was not their strength. Their ships were engineered to survive in conditions that would destroy any other vessel. They could maneuver through asteroid fields, dodge radiation storms, and navigate black holes with astonishing precision. These environments, previously thought to be impassable, became their highways and sanctuaries. The Deathworlders struck from places no enemy could predict, appearing out of nowhere and vanishing just as quickly, leaving destruction in their wake. Their technology was as much a psychological weapon as a physical one. The sheer unpredictability of their attacks caused panic, fear, and confusion among their enemies. The first major strike was aimed at a strategic hub of one of the largest interstellar alliances. This hub had been heavily fortified, with layers of shields, advanced weaponry, and thousands of defenders. To the leaders of the galaxy, it seemed impenetrable. Yet, the Deathworlders analyzed every system, every weak point, and every patrol route. They identified vulnerabilities that had been overlooked for decades and exploited them with surgical precision. Within hours, what was once a symbol of power and security lay in ruins. The survivors could only watch in disbelief as entire fleets, supply depots, and command centers were obliterated, often before they even realized the battle had begun. The psychological impact of these strikes was immense. Word of the destruction spread across multiple systems faster than the Deathworlders' fleets themselves. Planets that had never encountered them began to fear the approaching shadow of the Deathworlders. The once-calm politics of the galaxy were thrown into chaos. Leaders who had been certain of their security now found themselves questioning every decision, every alliance, and every plan. Fear became a weapon in itself, as civilizations turned on one another, seeking to protect themselves from the unknown threat. Distrust and paranoia spread as quickly as the fires of the attacks, weakening alliances and making coordinated defense nearly impossible. One of the most remarkable aspects of this phase of the campaign was the Deathworlders' ability to control the pace of conflict. Unlike other species that might have rushed forward in blind rage or panic, the Deathworlders struck selectively. They allowed some targets to appear untouched, creating a sense of false security and luring enemies into mistakes. They understood that chaos could be a weapon, but it had to be managed carefully. Each move was designed to maximize strategic advantage, demonstrating not only their power but also their mastery over the flow of battle. The Deathworlders also used intelligence in ways the galaxy had never imagined. Their operatives infiltrated communication networks, sabotaged supply lines, and spread misinformation to confuse and divide their enemies. This was not mere trickery. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign to weaken resistance before a direct strike was even necessary. Civilizations found themselves fighting shadows, reacting to threats that were often illusions, while the real power of the Deathworlders remained hidden until the moment of attack. This combination of deception, technology, and strategy made their campaign devastatingly effective. Every strike was deliberate, with a clear purpose. Planets that had harbored enemies or exploited the Deathworlders in the past were targeted first. Industrial centers, military bases, and transportation hubs were neutralized to disrupt the enemy's ability to respond. The Deathworlders were not interested in unnecessary destruction. They were interested in eliminating threats, sending a message, and establishing control over the situation. Their methodical approach ensured that their campaigns were not only destructive but also effective in achieving long-term objectives. The scale of the attacks began to astonish even those who had long feared the death. Entire fleets were annihilated in hours, sometimes before they could launch a single counterattack. Colonies that had been considered untouchable were reduced to ruins, leaving behind only the echoes of civilization. Survivors, if any, spoke in whispers of ships appearing out of nowhere, of defenses being bypassed with ease, and of a precision that seemed almost supernatural. Legends of the Deathworlders' capabilities began to spread, reinforcing fear and confusion across multiple systems. At the same time, the Deathworlders maintained discipline and coordination. Unlike other species that might have been tempted to indulge in looting or chaos, every member of the Deathworlder fleets acted according to a strict plan. Even in the heat of battle, Their focus remained on objectives, strategy, and minimizing unnecessary losses. This discipline, combined with their superior technology and intelligence, made them almost unstoppable. It was clear to the galaxy that the Deathworlders were not merely fighting for revenge. They were executing a campaign that had been planned for decades, and every strike was a calculated step toward a greater goal. The Deathworlders' attacks also exposed the weaknesses of the galaxy's defenses. Civilizations that had once prided themselves on their military strength found their strategies ineffective. Overconfidence, poor coordination, and reliance on outdated technology became fatal mistakes. The Deathworlders exploited these errors ruthlessly, demonstrating that intelligence, preparation, and adaptability could defeat raw power in numbers. Every victory was not only a tactical success but also a lesson for the galaxy. Underestimate the Deathworlders at your own peril. Despite the chaos and destruction, the Deathworlders' actions were not motivated by cruelty. Their goal was not to annihilate indiscriminately, but to establish control and enforce justice for centuries of exploitation and betrayal. Their strikes were precise, targeting those who had posed a threat or had failed to respect the Deathworlders' sovereignty. Civilizations that sought peace or demonstrated respect for the Deathworlders were often spared, though they were warned that future disobedience would carry consequences. This approach reinforced the Deathworlders' image as a species of strict but fair justice, willing to punish wrongdoing yet capable of mercy for those who acted wisely. As their campaign progressed, the Deathworlders' reputation grew even more formidable. Tales of their strategic brilliance, technological superiority, and unyielding discipline spread across the galaxy. Even species that had never encountered them directly began to take precautions, strengthen defenses, and reconsider alliances. The psychological impact of the Deathworlders' campaign was as significant as the physical destruction. Fear, uncertainty, and respect replaced arrogance and complacency. The galaxy was learning, often painfully, that the Deathworlders were a force that could not be ignored or underestimated. The Deathworlders demonstrated a remarkable ability to adapt in real time. When opponents tried to regroup, counterattack, or retreat, the Deathworlders anticipated every move. They adjusted strategies, shifted forces, and maintained the initiative at all times, no matter how clever their enemies thought they were. The Deathworlders were always several steps ahead, using strategy, technology, and discipline to maintain dominance. This adaptability ensured that their campaign continued without pause, striking fear into every corner of the galaxy. The galaxy had changed dramatically. Key systems had fallen, alliances were strained, and even the most powerful civilizations had been forced to confront the Deathworlders' strength. The once confident powers of the galaxy were now scrambling, reacting to a threat they had long dismissed. The Deathworlders had shown that preparation, intelligence, and patience could overcome raw power in numbers. The first major phase of their revenge was complete, and the stage was set for even greater actions to come. The fire of the Deathworlders' revenge was now spreading, and the galaxy could do nothing but watch in awe and terror. What had begun as a precise and calculated response to betrayal was transforming into a full-scale campaign that would reshape the balance of power across multiple star systems. Every victory reinforced the Deathworlders' reputation, every strike served as a lesson, and every act of strategy demonstrated the deadly efficiency of a species that had been forged in the harshest conditions imaginable. The Deathworlders had accomplished more than just tactical victories. They had shattered the illusions of security, exposed weaknesses, and demonstrated that intelligence and preparation could overcome even the greatest obstacles. The galaxy had been warned. The Deathworlders were not merely survivors, they were masters of strategy, and their revenge had only just begun. As the Deathworlders' campaign continued, the galaxy began to unravel in ways that no one could have predicted. What had started as targeted strikes and precise attacks quickly evolved into a series of events that exposed deep cracks in the alliances and empires that had once seemed unshakable. Civilizations that had prided themselves on their unity, technology, and military strength suddenly discovered that their power was fragile and that fear could corrode even the strongest bonds. The Deathworlders, through their strategy, patience, and discipline, were not only destroying military installations and fleets, they were dismantling the very structure of galactic politics. The first sign of this collapse came as the various factions within the alliances began to turn on each other. Panic spread rapidly after news of the Deathworlders' attacks reached planets far from the initial targets. Leaders who had once trusted one another began to suspect treachery, and small disagreements escalated into outright conflict. Supply lines were sabotaged, communication networks were disrupted, and coordination between allies broke down. In the confusion, some factions attempted to save themselves by betraying former allies, hoping that submission or deceit might protect them from the unstoppable force that was the Deathworlders. These betrayals, however, only accelerated the chaos, as trust had long been a fragile commodity in the galaxy and it was now shattered completely at the same time. The Deathworlders maintained their discipline and focus. Unlike their enemies, who were succumbing to fear, confusion, and internal conflict, the Deathworlders continued their campaign with precision. Their fleets struck key targets, bypassed minor defenses, and prioritized strategic locations that would maximize disruption. Industrial centers, communication hubs, and military outposts were neutralized with efficiency. The Deathworlders understood that a collapsing enemy was far more dangerous in some ways than a prepared one. By striking at critical points while allowing chaos to spread naturally, they created a situation in which even the most powerful civilizations could not mount a coherent defense. This phase of the campaign revealed just how deeply the Deathworlders understood the psychology of their enemies. They did not merely rely on brute force. They manipulated perception, fear, and decision-making to their advantage. False reports, misinformation, and carefully timed strikes made allies suspicious of one another. Civilizations began overreacting, wasting resources on perceived threats that were illusions, while the Deathworlders struck where it mattered most. Their approach demonstrated that war was as much about the mind as it was about technology and weapons. Every move the Deathworlders made was calculated to weaken morale, disrupt plans, and exploit mistakes. Even as the galaxy descended into disorder, the Deathworlders' actions were guided by long-term strategy. Unlike many species that might have sought vengeance in indiscriminate destruction, the Deathworlders carefully chose which targets to destroy and which to leave intact. Planets that had resisted them in the past were often the first to be attacked, but those who had shown respect or willingness to surrender were given opportunities to cooperate. This selective approach reinforced the idea that the Deathworlders' campaign was about justice, not mindless destruction. It also ensured that their power was respected and feared, not merely hated. Civilizations that survived learned to think carefully about their choices, knowing that the Deathworlders' judgment was precise and final. As the chaos spread, political leaders across the galaxy were forced into desperate decisions. Many attempted to flee, some sought secret alliances, while others attempted to bribe or negotiate with the Death. But the Deathworlders had anticipated these reactions. They had observed patterns in diplomacy, deception, and survival for decades, and they knew exactly how leaders would respond under pressure. Offers of surrender were carefully evaluated. Attempts at negotiation without genuine intent were exposed. Those who tried to manipulate or deceive the Deathworlders again faced swift consequences, demonstrating that the species had learned the hard lessons of betrayal and would not tolerate it again. The impact on the galactic economy was also catastrophic. Trade routes were disrupted, supply chains destroyed, and communication networks fractured. Resources that civilizations had relied on for centuries became inaccessible. Planets that had once been centers of wealth and influence were suddenly isolated, unable to receive aid or coordinate defenses. The Deathworlders did not attack blindly. They identified the critical points that sustained their enemy's power and neutralized them methodically. In doing so, they ensured that chaos would not just be temporary. It would have lasting consequences for the galaxy's structure and balance of power, even in the face of devastation. The Deathworlders maintained cohesion within their own ranks. Their fleets were disciplined, their strategies coordinated, and their people motivated by a shared understanding of purpose. Unlike their enemies, who were fractured by fear and mistrust, the Deathworlders acted as a unified force. This cohesion gave them a decisive advantage, allowing them to strike repeatedly without the confusion or hesitation that plagued their opponents. Every operation reinforced the strength of their unity and the intelligence behind their campaign. By the middle of this phase, the consequences of the Deathworlders' actions became impossible to ignore. Alliances that had once dominated large sections of the galaxy were crumbling. Political structures were destabilized, and formerly powerful civilizations were struggling to maintain order within their own borders. The Deathworlders had not only destroyed military installations and fleets, they had shattered the confidence of leaders, disrupted governance, and undermined trust at every level. The galaxy, once secure in its hierarchy and alliances, was now forced into chaos and uncertainty. The psychological effect of this phase cannot be overstated. Fear spread faster than the Deathworlders' fleets. Planets far from the conflict zones began preparing for attacks that might never come, redirecting resources from productive purposes toward defense. Leaders who had long dismissed the Deathworlders as a minor threat now realized that underestimating them had been a fatal mistake. Stories of the Deathworlders' precision, discipline, and ruthlessness circulated quickly, amplifying panic and distrust. Entire civilizations began doubting themselves, questioning their leaders, and fearing that survival might be impossible. At the same time, the Deathworlders' campaign forced innovation and adaptation. Some civilizations, desperate to survive, attempted new strategies, technologies, or alliances. But the Deathworlders were always several steps ahead. They anticipated countermeasures, observed experiments, and adjusted their plans accordingly. The galaxy was learning harsh lessons. The Deathworlders were not merely aggressive, they were intelligent, adaptable, and relentless. Every effort to resist without understanding their strategy ended in failure, reinforcing the lesson that brute force or arrogance could never overcome them despite the chaos. The Deathworlders did not lose sight of their ultimate goals. Their actions were not random acts of destruction, They were carefully calculated steps in a campaign designed to restore balance and justice in a galaxy that had long wronged them. Civilizations that had exploited or betrayed them were punished, but those who acted wisely and sought peace were given a chance to survive under terms dictated by the Deathworlders. This dual approach, combining discipline and selective mercy, ensured that their power was respected and feared, and that their reputation would continue to grow throughout the galaxy. The Deathworlders had fundamentally altered the structure of galactic power. Alliances that once seemed invincible were fractured, empires were destabilized, and civilizations were forced to reconsider every assumption they had made about strategy, loyalty, and survival. The Deathworlders had demonstrated that intelligence, preparation, and unity could overcome raw power in numbers. They had shown that patience, discipline, and foresight were far more effective than arrogance and complacency. The galaxy had been changed forever, and the message was clear: betrayal, underestimation, or exploitation of the Deathworlders would carry consequences that no civilization could ignore. The stage was now set for the final phase of the Deathworlders campaign. With alliances collapsing, leaders desperate, and civilizations in disarray, the Deathworlders had achieved what few species could. They had turned fear, strategy, and precision into tools that reshaped the galaxy itself. Every strike, every calculated move, and every moment of discipline had prepared them for the ultimate moment when the galaxy would face the full force of their power. The flames of revenge were spreading, and by the time the final phase arrived, few would remain untouched by the consequences of underestimating the Deathworlders. The Deathworlders proved a fundamental truth: chaos can be controlled, fear can be directed, and the mind is the deadliest weapon in war. By dismantling alliances, exposing weaknesses, and forcing civilizations to turn on one another, they had ensured that when the final phase of their campaign began, that galaxy would be ripe for their decisive action. Every victory, every act of strategy, and every demonstration of discipline had brought them closer to their ultimate goal: reshaping the galaxy, punishing betrayal, and establishing a new order that would endure for generations. By the time the final phase of the Deathworlders campaign began, the galaxy had already been transformed. Alliances were fractured, empires weakened, and fear had spread to the farthest reaches of space. The Deathworlders had achieved what few species could. They had reshaped the balance of power not only through combat but through strategy, intelligence, and psychological dominance. Civilizations that had once underestimated them now understood that the Deathworlders were not merely survivors, they were masters of war, cunning beyond comprehension, and a force that demanded respect. This final stage of their campaign would demonstrate the full scope of their power, resolve, and vision for a galaxy where betrayal and arrogance had consequences. The Deathworlders' approach in this phase was both methodical and overwhelming. They did not rush blindly into destruction. They selected targets based on strategic value, historical context, and potential impact. Worlds that had actively participated in the exploitation or betrayal of the Deathworlders were among the first to face their full might. Industrial hubs, military bases, and key population centers were neutralized with precision, leaving few survivors. The message was clear: those who had ignored warnings, broken treaties, or underestimated the Deathworlders would pay a high price. At the same time, worlds that demonstrated willingness to cooperate, respect, or humility were approached differently. They were given opportunities to surrender, preserve life, and align with the new order being established. This dual approach reinforced the Deathworlders' reputation as a species of strict but fair judgment, blending fear with opportunity. As the Deathworlders advanced, their fleets became a symbol of inevitability. Entire star systems trembled at the sight of their ships, which moved with unmatched speed, precision, and coordination. They appeared seemingly out of nowhere, striking without warning, and then vanishing just as suddenly. Their ships were not merely instruments of destruction, they were tools of psychological warfare. Civilizations witnessing the sudden appearance and disappearance of Deathworlder fleets realized that conventional defenses were almost useless. Attempts to counterattack were often too late, as the Deathworlders had already calculated every move, exploited weaknesses, and neutralized the most critical threats. The combination of technology, strategy, and psychological pressure ensured that each engagement strengthened their dominance while eroding the morale of the galaxy. This phase also revealed the Deathworlders' unparalleled ability to coordinate multiple operations across vast distances. While some fleets were neutralizing enemy strongholds, others were cutting off supply lines, intercepting communications, and ensuring that survivors could not regroup. Even in distant sectors, the Deathworlders' influence could be felt, as rumors, misinformation, and sudden attacks sowed fear and mistrust. The galaxy had never faced an enemy that could simultaneously strike on so many fronts with such calculated efficiency. Civilizations were forced to scramble resources, abandon long-term strategies, and respond reactively rather than proactively. This chaos played directly into the Deathworlders' hands, allowing them to maintain initiative, dictate terms, and consolidate their position as the dominant force. The Deathworlders' strategy was not purely military. They understood the power of symbolism and reputation. As worlds fell or submitted, stories of their precision, intelligence, and discipline spread faster than the fleets themselves. Legends of Deathworlder strikes became tales whispered across star systems, inspiring awe, fear, and caution. Leaders of civilizations that had never encountered them personally began to act preemptively, strengthening defenses, reconsidering alliances, and avoiding any action that might provoke the Deathworlders' wrath. In this way, the Deathworlders expanded their influence far beyond the reach of their fleets, creating an empire of respect and fear without the need for constant occupation at the same time. The Deathworlders' discipline and cohesion ensured that internal chaos did not interfere with their goals. Every member of their society understood the stakes and their role within the larger plan. Even in the heat of battle, coordination remained perfect. Units acted in unison, with each strike and maneuver calculated to achieve maximum impact. Unlike their enemies, who were fractured by fear, distrust, and desperation, the Deathworlders functioned as a single, cohesive organism. This unity magnified their power, turning what might have been a conventional war into an almost unstoppable campaign of dominance and restructuring. The consequences for the galaxy were profound. Worlds that resisted were left in ruins, their populations decimated, economies collapsed, and infrastructure destroyed. Planets that had previously been centers of trade, governance, or military might were suddenly isolated and weakened. Survivors were often scattered, living in fear, and dependent on the Deathworlders' terms for survival. Meanwhile, worlds that surrendered or demonstrated compliance were integrated into a new order. These civilizations retained life and stability but under strict conditions designed to prevent future betrayal or exploitation. The Deathworlders were creating a galaxy in which respect, caution, and strategic thinking were essential for survival, a galaxy where their lessons would resonate for generations. Despite the destruction, there was a sense of justice in the Deathworlders' actions. They did not act out of indiscriminate cruelty. They targeted those who had wronged them or posed a threat. Civilizations that had attempted to manipulate, deceive, or exploit them faced swift and decisive consequences. Conversely, those who had acted with honesty, humility, or respect were often spared or offered terms that preserved their society. This principle of selective punishment reinforced the Deathworlders' image as enforcers of balance. Their revenge was not chaotic or emotional, it was precise, deliberate, and based on long-held principles of justice as they understood it. As the final battles of this phase unfolded, the galaxy began to recognize the scale and purpose of the Deathworlders' campaign. It was no longer just retaliation, it was a restructuring of power, a demonstration that survival, respect, and intelligence were more important than arrogance and exploitation. Civilizations that had once considered themselves untouchable were forced to re-evaluate their assumptions about strength, strategy, and governance. Fear became a tool of enforcement, and the Deathworlders' reputation ensured that even distant systems adjusted their behavior preemptively. By the end of this phase, the galaxy had been irrevocably changed. In addition to their military prowess, the Deathworlders displayed an uncanny ability to maintain morale and unity among their own people. They had trained for decades to act as a cohesive force, and every member of their society understood the importance of discipline, strategy, and purpose. This internal strength contrasted sharply with the chaos and panic among their enemies. Their society had been forged in the harshest conditions of their homeworld, and the lessons learned from centuries of survival translated directly into their effectiveness in this galactic campaign. Every individual acted with intent, contributing to the larger strategy and ensuring that the Deathworlders' objectives were achieved without unnecessary loss or error. By the conclusion of the campaign, the Deathworlders had achieved what few species in galactic history had ever managed. Entire civilizations had been humbled, alliances fractured, and the balance of power had shifted decisively in their favor. Worlds that once ignored, mocked, or exploited them now understood the consequences of arrogance. The Deathworlders had demonstrated that intelligence, preparation, and unity could overcome even the greatest armies and most complex political systems. Their campaign was a testament to patience, strategy, and the unforgiving nature of justice when long wrongs go unpunished. The galaxy was forever altered by the Deathworlders' actions. Planets bore scars of destruction, political alliances had been redrawn, and civilizations had learned harsh lessons in fear, respect, and the consequences of betrayal. Stories of the Deathworlders' precision, discipline, and strategy spread like wildfire, becoming legends that would influence generations to come. Leaders across the galaxy would remember the events not just for the destruction, but for the lesson that underestimating a species forged in adversity could be catastrophic ultimately. The Deathworlders' revenge was not merely about punishment, it was about establishing a new order. They had acted with purpose, precision, and foresight, ensuring that the galaxy would remember their power and respect their sovereignty. Those who survived learned that respect, intelligence, and honesty were essential for coexistence, while arrogance, betrayal, and exploitation carried consequences that could span centuries. The Deathworlders had not sought mindless conquest. They had sought balance, justice, and acknowledgement. In the aftermath, the galaxy entered a new era, one in which the name Deathworlders would be synonymous with unyielding power, strategic brilliance, and inevitable justice. It was clear that the Deathworlders story was not just one of revenge, it was a story of survival, intelligence, and the consequences of underestimation. The galaxy had learned that patience, planning, and discipline could shape the destiny of entire civilizations. The Deathworlders had taken their place not merely as survivors of a harsh world, but as masters of a galaxy that had long forgotten the lessons of caution, respect, and foresight. The flames of their revenge had burned, not indiscriminately, but with purpose, leaving a galaxy that would never forget the power of those who had been underestimated, and whose patience had been tested for centuries.